I contacted our speaker around 2 years ago, and then kept putting it off because of COVID. But luckily, COVID seems to be on the run, so we decided to go ahead and have it. And of course, our topic planned 2 years ago couldn't be more apropos, focus on Russia. And tonight, the historian from Christine Evans from UWM History Department. Next week, of course, again, couldn't be more pertinent, public opinion in Putin's Russia by Dr. John Roda. And then Music and Power on March 9th by Dr. Karen Evans Romaine from UW-Madison. And then finally, our own Graham Reed from the Director of Collections will be talking about the art and artifice of early Soviet propaganda. So thank you for coming out, and I'm going to turn the full introduction over to my colleague, Professor Kurt Kivella.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Hey, people. First of all, congratulations. We all survived the great ice storm of 2-2-2-2, otherwise known as Tuesday. Great to see everybody. My name is Kurt Kivella. I have the pleasure of teaching history here. Make sure I stick to my script. As Professor Hayes just mentioned, we usually do this community lecture series in the fall, but because of the ongoing COVID delays, this is the kickoff to this year's topic, Russia. I should make mention here that this first lecture is sponsored by the Friends of Matt Zillig, who honor the memory of a beloved friend and global citizen. We are extremely fortunate tonight to host our first speaker in this series, Dr. Christine Evans. She is an associate professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She received her PhD in 2010 from University of California, Berkeley. Her first book, Between Truth and Time, A History of Soviet Central Television, was published by Yale University Press in 2016 and will be published in Russian translation by New Literary Observer Press in Moscow later this year. How cool is that? Dr. Evans' current book project, co-authored with Lars Lundgren of Södertörn University in Sweden, and entitled No Heavenly Bodies, Satellite Communications Networks, Global Media, and the Cold War, explores the transnational history of satellite communications infrastructure. Professor Evans' talk tonight is aptly titled Binge Watching the Past, Russian History and Russia Today. Following her presentation, we'll have time for some questions and answers, so start thinking about those right now. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Evans.
Thank you so much to Professor Hayes for this invitation, and to Professor Kivella for the introduction, and especially to Professor Hayes for making what now seems the extremely prescient decision 2 years ago to choose Russia as the focus for the lecture series. The timing really couldn't be better. So this past summer, during Russian President Vladimir Putin's annual live call-in show that he does most years, called Direct Line with Vladimir Putin, he answered a question about why he did not consider Ukraine to be an unfriendly country. His answer was that he has long considered and still believes that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. The question and Putin's beliefs on this issue were sufficiently important to him that he shared this summer on the Kremlin's website, less than 2 weeks later, a lengthy historical treatise explaining the basis for this claim from the shared beginnings of Russian and Ukrainian history in the 9th century foundation of a state known as Kievan Rus. On Monday, Putin delivered an uncharacteristically angry speech that was similarly focused on the history of Russia and Ukraine, in which he argued that independent Ukraine is essentially a historical error that must be corrected. So back in 2019, when I titled this talk, when Professor Hayes first approached me about this lecture, I decided to talk about Russian television, and I called the lecture Binge Watching the Past, because as a historian of Soviet television, I was struck by how much of Putin-era television and Russian public life as a whole was dominated by revisiting, revising, and promoting new historical narratives. So many television series were set in the past and in the Soviet period in particular, and are currently being produced in huge quantities that Russian commentators have referred to this phenomenon as retromania. So I put just a few examples of some of the recent TV shows set in every era. From this one on the bottom is called The Golden Horde, and it's set in the era of Mongol domination in Russia, all the way forward to the Soviet period with Furtseva, which is a biopic about a Soviet cultural, kind of the top woman in the Central Committee who ran cultural affairs for a while in her life. An obsession with the past and its meaning should be something that connects our recent experiences living in the US to Russians in the present. A bright student I had last fall who was frustrated with American conflicts over the meaning of history and protests around statues celebrating Confederate leaders in the South in the summer of 2020 asked with some exasperation, I bet Russia isn't focused on digging up all the dark parts of their past. But Russia's public struggles over the past have been at least as intense as ours, with the Russian state playing a much more central role in imposing some historical stories and silencing or seeking to control the narrative of others. So I'm going to try to introduce you. Professor Hayes mentioned that they like the historian to go first because you get a bigger picture kind of overview that launches the lecture series, gets you ready for more specialized conversations later. So I'm going to try to do some sort of mini overview today by looking at some of the historical events that have been most central to efforts to rewrite and control Russia's past. So some of these are examples of conflict, and some of them are examples of historical figures that I've noticed are becoming more prominent recently. And this has all, of course, been in the news, so I'm looking forward to the question and answer session since Russia's president is such an active amateur historian. I saw a pretty good tweet the other day suggesting that of the impacts of COVID, perhaps President Putin being locked in a bunker reading a library full of books about Ukraine was going to be one of the major impacts of the pandemic. All right, so my first section here is the question, who owns Kiev and Rus? And I'd like to start to talk about Kiev and Rus and its very complicated history by looking at a particular object. So one thing I like to do with students in particular is to make things more concrete by looking at a thing to understand the past through an object. So this, you may recognize this particular object. It's a powerful symbol of Russia's past. And supporters of President Putin gave him a replica for his birthday back in 2002, leading to some sort of memed mockery of him with, for example, this meme that depicts him looking at this gift and saying, dreams can come true. So this image is frequently used in hostile political cartoons, criticizing Putin's desire for autocratic power, despite being an ostensibly elected leader. It certainly symbolizes to modern Russians the glory and power of Russia's past. And they read it in light of a mythologized story that Russian citizens learn about this object in childhood history books. So the myth of the cap of Monomach, as this thing is known, there we go, is recorded in the Tale of the Princes of Vladimir, an early 16th century story written probably in about the 1520s that claimed that the Rus founding dynasty of the 800s, the Rurik dynasty, were descended from the Roman emperors. It's said in this tale that the cap was a gift in the 1100s from the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Monomach to Vladimir, Grand Prince of Kiev, who then came to be called Vladimir Monomach. So the tale concludes by saying, and thus, even to this day, the Grand Princes of Vladimir are crowned with the imperial crown, which the Greek Tsar, Constantine Monomach, sent. And indeed, this does appear, this crown, in coronation ceremonies, kind of all the way from the 1600s, all the way up to Nicholas II in the late 19th century. All right. So the tale of the cap of Monomach puts Russia near the center of the history of Christianity, of universal empires, including the Roman Empire, and of Western civilization, therefore, as a whole. The real history of the cap is much more complicated. Back to my cap. The link between these supposed events in Kiev and Rus and the Muscovite state that gained power by the 14th century is not exactly a direct path. Invaders who founded the dynasty were most likely Scandinavian, something that Putin does not mention when he talks about Kiev and Rus. I think with the sense that, pleasant welfare state Sweden, right, doesn't make a very impressive kind of origin story. Nonetheless, they were Vikings. They may have initially plundered or traded with Slavic villages and then come to acquire the status of princes, defending the local Slavic population, mixing with them from other pirates in exchange for tribute. So this dramatic there's a dramatic story that appears in lots of Russian television reconstructions and documentary films about this time, of local Slavic tribes inviting Scandinavian invaders to rule them. There's not a great deal of evidence about this sort of moment of invitation. There's plenty of archaeological evidence that these same Scandinavians had been living and traveling among the local population, which itself was already very ethnically mixed, including Turkic peoples as well as Slavic ones, for centuries by this point. There are plenty of Viking boat burials all over northern Rus. They traveled overland through what is now Russia to rich capitals of the time like Constantinople and Baghdad in search of silver and other treasure. So does Russian history begin in Kievan Rus? Maybe, maybe not. It's a political choice to argue that it is or isn't. And there's many other stories that also begin in Kievan Rus. Kiev is, of course, now the capital of independent Ukraine, a state whose current political elite defines itself against Russia. In the time of the Kievan Rus princes, the words Russia and Russians did not exist, and links to the eventual Principality of Muscovy, from which the current Russian state does more or less spring, are quite tenuous. At the same time, there are a lot of reasons to begin Russian history with Kievan Rus as well, in addition to the importance of Russian political origin stories, right? It's a kind of political origin simply because they believe that it is. Many cultural features of the Kievan state did help give coherence to the state and do connect Kiev to Muscovy, along with other places. The dynastic lineage provides one connection, religious affiliation. The Kievan Rus princes accepted Christianity from Constantinople in 988, so before, crucially, the break between the Western and Eastern churches in 1054. And with the church came the need for a written alphabet for the diverse local Slavic dialects in the late 9th century. So two apostles to the Slavs, Cyril and Methodius, develop what later becomes the Cyrillic alphabet that Russian still uses. The law that was developed in Kievan Rus, the kind of consultative political model. So if we think about different futures that come out of the origin point of Kievan Rus, well, what about the Russian Duma, which is a consultative body that takes its name from the same institution in Kievan Rus? So maybe the heritage of Rus is actually consultative democracy. Moreover, so other kinds of architecture, right, all helped shape subsequent Russian history or were drawn upon by Russian rulers and historians to explain and legitimize the present. So Putin kept declaring this past Monday night that Kievan Rus was the largest state in Europe, but the Kievan Principality that did emerge was really not a state as we currently understand state. I think I have a map of Kievan Rus here. So this is the territory that he's talking about. Kievan princes announced laws, but they were mostly symbolic and not directly enforceable. There was not much of a real modern bureaucracy, as would be typical of the 9th century, right, to enforce anything. And Kievan Rus had a lot of affiliated principalities that were in this big green territory, including Novgorod and Chernigov, that were just as impressive as Kiev in terms of their size and population, and were really not controlled by Kiev in any meaningful way. So the history of Kievan Rus is a source for many possible visions of Russian-Ukrainian relations in the present, not only Putin's vision of kind of redomination by the Russian Empire, but of connectedness without domination, right? All part of one loose affiliation. So after Vladimir Monomak's death, his lands were divided and contested by powers in what are now Ukraine and Belarus and Novgorod, Lithuania, Moscow, and Vladimir. Then Kiev was sacked by the Mongols in 1240, when things become even more fragmented, right? So Kievan Rus is the beginning point of quite a number of states. You could also argue that Poland is the inheritor of the legacy of Kievan Rus, or Belarus, or any number of other places in the region. So in his speech to the Russian people on Monday night, and in a previous speech this past summer, Putin has aggressively insisted that Russia is the only real inheritor of Kievan Rus. But I think we can argue that this straight path and this single claim are probably not the only stories we could tell. So why invent this straight path, which is what the cap of Monomakh does? So the tale of the Cap of Monomoch does tell us a lot about Muscovite politics in the 16th century, which is when the tale describing the cap and giving it this origin story was written in the 1520s. So as I said, it gave the Moscow princes in their new rising and expanding state the heritage that they wanted at that time. Rome, Byzantium, Christianity, Kievan Rus, the Principality of Vladimir that they were superseding, that's right next door. It provided a founding myth and a source of legitimacy suited to a time when Muscovite princes were expanding westward. So they were looking for a Western history to help explain themselves and legitimize themselves as they become involved in the Baltic Sea trade and start diplomatic relations with European powers. So the physical crown serves as a potent visual symbol. I need to go back to my crown. To accompany the myth, which is included in one way or another in all of these coronation ceremonies going forward. But this myth of the cap conceals the cap's real story. Where is it actually from? I still haven't told you. So it was not a gift from Byzantium to Rus. The dates are wrong. Constantine Monomoch lived almost a century before Vladimir Monomoch and therefore could not have given him anything. But it also wasn't a pure fake. They didn't make the cap at the same time as they wrote this story. The cap was already there. And in fact, it was an esteemed treasure in the regalia of the Moscow Grand Princes for almost 2 centuries before the tale of the Princes of Vladimir was written. And it came to Moscow not from Byzantium, but from the east through the culture of the Mongol Empire and the Golden Horde, the most famous leader of which was Genghis Khan. So it was probably made in the Mongol Empire in Crimea or Central Asia in the late 13th or early 14th century. It was probably a gift to a Muscovite prince during the time when Muscovy was subordinated to the Mongols, so the early 13th through late 14th century. So in its original form, it was a golden skull cap with 8 gracefully curving golden panels overlaid with delicate gold filigree. So you can see they've added some things, right? There's some fur to celebrate the kind of heritage of Siberian fur wealth. They've added a cross on top to make that Christian heritage really clear. But if you kind of strip those features away, you're left with, oops, wrong order, sorry about that, a Central Asian skull cap, right? That's the basic design, though a very fancy one. So this reminds us of the importance of the Mongol period to Russian history, which actually is the moment when Moscow becomes the center of the Russian Empire. So there's been a great deal of negative writing about the legacy of the Mongols in Russia. It's a kind of cultural myth in Russia that this was a great burden. And indeed, there were very high taxes from the Mongol horde and frequent large-scale seizures of people for the slave trade during the moment of initial conquest. However, there was also a great deal of political influence, right? Successful Russian princes gained the right to be tax collectors and became rich that way, and also gained important military alliances within the horde. So Russia becomes, the Russian principalities become successful, well-paid tax collectors for the Golden Horde and learn a great deal about steppe diplomacy, which then shapes their own ideas about empire. All right, there are many positives, however, to the Mongol era as well. There was a tolerant approach to empire that accepted religious diversity, did not require direct rule. They really just wanted to collect taxes and were happy to allow the Orthodox Church to flourish. All sorts of kind of bureaucratic development and communications lines. They had an excellent horse-based postal system, kind of like the Pony Express. So Russian telegraph lines were built along those routes rather than along the railroad as in other places, because railroad developments were quite late in Russia, and they already had these great postal routes over land using horses. So here's this cap, a piece of Mongol treasure. And Muscovites aren't sure how to handle this legacy. It's a problem for them as they establish diplomatic ties with Europe, so they decide to rewrite it and give it a new story, a Christian past rather than a Mongol one, when in fact they genuinely have both. All right. So certainly figures and items like this from the Kievan past have become extremely prominent since Putin is quite interested in this period and has been developing his arguments about the connection between Russia and Kiev, or Kievan Rus, quite actively. So an earlier Kievan prince, Vladimir, who's the one who converts to Christianity in 988, he's actually baptized in Crimea, which gives you a sense of why, one reason among many, why Crimea is so important symbolically to both Russians and Ukrainians, was put up directly outside red square. As you can see, it's very large. And this went up in 2016. It's really on the edge of the Kremlin, so in the most kind of symbolic central spot in Russia today. This enormous, very tall statue of Kievan Prince Vladimir. So not Vladimir Monomakh, but an earlier one. There is also, however, a 1988 statue of Prince Vladimir, or Volodymyr as he is in Ukrainian, of Kiev, the same prince that was erected in London by the Ukrainian diaspora. So kind of political claims about the significance of the people who've inherited the legacy of Prince Volodymyr has been ongoing for some time. There is even a 2015 Russian submarine named after Vladimir Monomakh, the later Vladimir. So there's quite a bit of kind of active signaling of this historical significance of these figures. All right. And there's also, I should add, always important to influence children, a 2006 cartoon movie aimed at Russian children featuring the life of Prince Vladimir as a kind of hero for them to emulate. All right. So the tale of the Kappa Monomakh was created at a moment when Europe became central to the Muscovite state's ambitions. And I think maybe that tells us something about Putin's intentions today. His obsessive focus on Kievan Rus and its political legacy may tell us something similar about his interests. So however friendly his meetings with Chinese President Xi Jinping may be, it's not a coincidence that his threats of expansion are generally not along Russia's Asian borders, right? He's really interested in the West. That is the legacy that engages him. All right, and this has been a longstanding question in Russian life. So kind of what really is Russia's relationship with Europe? And this is a very old question. So in the imperial period, the problem of Russia's relationship with Europe is a vexed question that preoccupies the Russian elite. There's really nothing strange about this, right? All countries consider their relationships with other countries. The United States also has a vexed relationship with Europe, where we see all the good and bad things that we desire or wish to reject in ourselves kind of projected on that screen, right? But for reasons specific to Russia, this questioning was very intense, right? An agonizing appraisal of Russia's final place. Truly, how is it related to the West? So why was that so intense? The first reason is geography. So Russia's position on the eastern periphery of Europe, its sheer size, its the largest country in the world, is isolating. Second, Russia was the only major part of Europe which, although Christian, has a form of Christianity, Russian Orthodoxy, which separates it from Europe, right, where Roman Catholicism predominated. The Balkans and Greece, where other Orthodox areas, of course, were under the control of the Ottoman Empire for a long time. So Russia lacked the experience of allegiance to Rome, as well as the experience of a Reformation, and whether Russia experienced the Renaissance is somewhat unclear. There's arguments about this. So as the Russian Empire expands in the 16th to 17th centuries, the percentage of the population that's Slavic and Orthodox also shrinks, right, further challenging its identity as part of Christian Europe. One might also add that Russia's intensification of serfdom starting in the 17th century, so its dependence on slave labor, produced, much like in the United States, by labor shortage in agriculture and the desire to kind of trap a labor force in place, also isolates it further and makes its position relative to Europe even stranger when we get to the 19th century and European nationalism emerges, and it emerges that the kind of tidal ethnic national group in Russia, the Russians, are 90% enslaved, right? How does that affect them? This causes a great deal of concern, as you can imagine. Furthermore, there's the need for the access to the sea. And I think we see this in some of Putin's moves and his interest in a figure I'll get to in a moment that has come out recently. So the Baltic and the Black Seas in particular. So in a famous 1942 book, the historian Robert Kerner argued that the urge to the sea was the most important driving force in Russian history. Its overland access to Europe was blocked by centuries of animosity with Poland, Lithuania, and with Sweden, Russia's two chief enemies to the west. And until Peter the Great, who I'll talk about in a moment, Russia was really cut off from military technology from the West. So it saw breaking this land and sea isolation from Europe as imperative. And to do this, Russia had to borrow in order to get better military technology and break this blockade separating it from Europe. But this then, when you want to borrow military technology, it raises the question, can you just borrow the kind of science and industry necessary for advanced weapons, or do you also need to borrow social forms, right? Maybe society needs to be modernized, or culture. You know, how much comes along with that sort of military borrowing? The question of Russia's relationship to the West is not only a preoccupation for Putin, but for much of Russia's intellectual and artistic elites, including conservative elites. So one takeaway point I really want to convey tonight is that these battles over the Russian past are much bigger than Putin and engage a very broad Russian public, right? There's a lot of concern among Russia experts that people think that, you know, Putin is really the only force for change in Russia, right? In fact, it's a complicated society, and he requires some amount of consent to govern, like everyone. And there's many of these debates run very deep. Okay. One example of this is the 2002 movie that some of you may have seen, directed by Alexander Sokurov, which won international recognition specifically for its technical achievement of being filmed in a single continuous take inside the Hermitage Art Museum. So it's kind of crazy to watch if you like that sort of thing. It's just one shot for the whole movie. The technical feat in itself was a kind of ideological claim that Russian history could be narrated as a contiguous, uninterrupted whole, like one take and we've told you the whole story. And it's one that takes place almost entirely among westernized nobles in the halls of the Winter Palace, to the exclusion of most of Russia's actual history of forced labor, as well as its enormous ethnic and religious diversity. The film's message, which is right there in its title, is that the West has become morally bankrupt, obsessed with sex and tolerant of homosexuality, and only Russia can save the heritage of Western civilization. So Russia is a literal ark, preserving Western culture through the stormy seas of the moral collapse of the rest of the West. So that's the argument of that movie. Sorry to give it away. My apologies. Still fun to watch. All right. So one striking example of Putin's effort, to re-narrate Russian history as both part of and superior to Europe, which is a kind of classic idea straight out of Russia's 19th century intellectual life, like we are different and part of, but also doing better, is the return of Peter the Great as the object of public celebration. So Peter the Great, who ruled Russia, he started in 1682, but he was kind of a child then, let's say kind of 1697 until his death in 1725, was the author of Russia's rapid westernization in the early 18th century, conducted very much from above and with significant violence toward Russia's nobility, which was forced to suddenly dress in German clothes, shave their beards, and bring their women out of seclusion to court, where Peter insisted that these poor Muscovite noblewomen, who had until recently not appeared in public, dance and wear the low-cut dresses then in vogue in German and French courts. So Peter's effort to impose rapid westernization and economic modernization on Russian society made most people's lives dramatically worse, although it was very, I should say with the clothes, it was quite impactful. So this is a slide of every one of the Romanov Tsars. And you can see where Peter's number 4 up there on the top. Oh wait, I have a laser pointer. Let's do it. Here's Peter. From him forward, everyone looks like a European noble, right? There's no more distinctive Russian clothing. So however, this effort to transform Russian society made people's lives quite bad. From heavy taxes on the unserved peasantry to pay for his constant wars, to the obligation for noble families to send their sons as young as age 12 or 13 to serve starting in the ranks of the army. They could not start as officers, and often abroad in Peter's endless wars with Sweden and the Ottoman Empire, working their way up through the ranks for years to attain an officer's rank. Peter also was quite violent in person. He used hypermasculinity to project power. So if you're familiar with the stereotype behavior of fraternities, this is how Peter conducted himself. Heavy drinking, copious eating, the consumption of women as well, in excess. So this is a kind of early modern form of masculinity that projected power and was quite unpleasant to be around if you were a member of his court. He also beat people with his own hands, including his friends. So the memory of Peter has changed over time. Stalin admired him as an example of a strong leader, but his violent legacy remains controversial, right? He was really a kind of both very influential and sort of dark figure. But Peter has lately been quite central in Putin-era public culture. So he first reemerged via a controversial statue That was put up in the Moscow River in 1997 by the artist Zurab Tsereteli for the 300th anniversary of the Russian Navy, which Peter founded. As you can see from this picture, it's not the most beautiful statue. It was seen immediately by Muscovites as large, ugly. It was extremely expensive as well at a moment of great poverty in the country. But it's certainly highly post-Soviet, right? This was not the kind of statuary, whether you like it or not, that was typical of the commemorative culture in the Soviet Union. Peter is not emphasized in Sokurov's movie Russian Ark. So there's a brief dark scene. They go through like I use it in class because it covers every ruler. They kind of go through them all in order in this one take. And there's this kind of brief dark scene in the beginning where you see Peter like hitting someone in the dark. So it's a poor fit for the idea that Russia is more civilized than the morally corrupt West kind of argument of that movie. So there's not a lot of Peter in there. But suddenly he's much more visible, and he got a great deal of airtime in the 2014 Sochi Olympics and the opening ceremonies, which retold Russian history, which is, again, not the way every country chooses to spend its Olympics opening ceremony in a historical narrative, right, about where we come from and where we're going, but that is what they did in Sochi. All right. If you're curious later, I can show you a clip, but here are some screenshots from that. Peter appears twice. There's a kind of live action film where both of these, they sort of tell the story twice of Kievan Rus to Peter the Great in a little live action movie, and then in this kind of in the stadium big performance. But in both cases, the narrative starts in Greece. So again, there's this claim that Russia is coming right from Greece rather than from Scandinavia. You see the Parthenon. Then you cut right to Peter kind of sailing on his ships and the navy that he founded. All right. There's quite a bit of Peter in that, always in connection with ships and sailing, and he plays a central role in a new nationwide set of history museums and theme parks known as Russia, My History. So the kind of personalizing the sense of Russian narrative is something that, to you as a museum goer, is your story as well. And there's a youth contest, sort of essay and art contest for young people in Russia about the image of the young Peter. So he's also a relatable youth figure. All right. So why? Why is Peter the Great back? The Petrine conquests in the Baltic and the city of Narva on the Russian border with what is now Estonia, and the Sea of Azov at the northern part of where Crimea hits the Black Sea. I should use my map now. All right, so here's the Sea of Azov is down here. Peter did not add, this is a map of territory that Peter added, which is in purple. Peter did not add any territory in the Sea of Azov, but he fought his most important naval battles there. It's just that the Ottoman Empire was still strong enough that he didn't really gain any territory. Nonetheless, it's a central place in his myth as his naval achievements begin here. This is notably right in the area where Putin's current military and naval activities are happening with Crimea and then also that coast of Ukraine along the north there. And then Narva, which is here, St. Petersburg. Where's Narva? Just a little further over on the coast. And the Baltics that Peter gains access to and the kind of Baltic seaports, is another place where people in contemporary Estonia are very, very afraid that Russian tanks will at any moment just roll over the border. So I almost had cut this year my military section of my Peter the Great lecture, and then I looked at the geography and I was like, oh, I better leave this in, because it's the same places, right, that Putin is kind of most threatening at the moment. All right. So Peter was also, it's a particular view of Russian history to emphasize Peter. He was the first emperor of Russia. He gave himself that Western Roman-inspired title, angering many European leaders who had not taken that title for themselves. And it's the polar opposite of the Muscovite Tsar in Russian history, like Ivan the Terrible, which has a kind of different resonance in contemporary Russia. So I think the choice of Peter over someone like Ivan or any of the Muscovite Tsars that might have been chosen partially reflects Putin's hostility to ethnic nationalists in Russia today who tend to celebrate pre-Petrine Russia. So for a really kind of conservative ethnic nationalist, Peter is absolutely not the hero you would select. He is someone who turned Russia away from its true Orthodox heritage. And indeed, right-wing extremists have really embraced Ivan the Terrible, so much so that, as some of you may have heard in the news, in 2018, this painting of Ivan the Terrible in the Tretyakov Gallery was attacked by Orthodox extremists who found it to be a violation of the memory of Ivan the Terrible, who they want canonized as a saint. So Putin has that dimension too, right? I think there's a kind of American idea that maybe Putin is a conservative ethno-nationalist, but that's far from the truth. He's absolutely very aware of Russia's multi-ethnic heritage, and he's trying to contain the influence of religious nationalists on the right of him. All right, so Peter is very much not Ivan the Terrible in that way. He's an imperial, multi-ethnic ruler over a great empire. All right. So many of the fights over Russia's past, naturally, are not chiefly about these really ancient figures, right? I've indulged myself, and Putin has indulged himself, thinking about these older periods of time. In fact, the relationship to the present of these kinds of figures is, by definition, mostly fictional, right? These are mostly these figures are functioning mostly as ways to talk about politics in the present through the past. The most intense struggles over the past, as in the United States, are about the recent past and the Soviet era in particular, where peoples have in their living memory relatives who participated in or suffered in the events of the 20th century. So given the historical traumas of Russia's history, especially in the Soviet period, it really shouldn't be surprising that the post-Soviet period has been marked by memory wars about the meaning of key historical events. So there's two major historical traumas in particular. The first is World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, as it's known in Russian. That's very, very central to Putin's authority and legitimation. He's really, the cult of World War II began under Leonid Brezhnev in kind of got most amplified in the late 60s, really gets going in the 70s. And Putin has fully embraced that. World War II is the number one thing happening in Russian public commemoration. It's just a massive investment in commemorating that experience and the Russian victory, the Soviet victory. The other trauma is the one that you probably thought of first, which is that the victims of Stalin, right? So people who were executed during Stalin's terror or confined in the Gulag. So it's a much smaller number of people who are affected by that, but still a very large number. And you know, it's still a very live experience for people who, for example, it's still possible to run into in the street the person who was your school classmate in the late 1930s, whose father denounced your father, resulting in his arrest and execution, right? You could just run into that person in Moscow, as happened to a translator who wrote a memoir about it. So World War II is so important to post-Soviet Russian life because there are no shared post-Soviet holidays in the country beyond Victory Day, right, and New Year's Eve. So Victory Day becomes very important. There were efforts to create new holidays, a kind of National Unity Day or Russian Independence Day. None of them really took. But Victory Day is authentically enjoyed and appreciated by all Russian citizens, for the most part, right? 25 million people died in World War II in Russia, and so almost everyone has at least one grandparent who was affected or participated in some way. Plus, World War II serves to unify all the levels of memory, right? Individual, family, community and collective, national, and government, right? The state's memory. So all of those things are kind of brought together very conveniently by World War II. As a result, it's very hotly contested and policed by the state. So one example of this is in 2014, there was an independent television station called TV Rain that did have national broadcasting power on the air, and it ran a poll asking its viewers whether Russia should have surrendered Leningrad rather than allow 1 million people to starve in the siege of Leningrad during World War II. And as a result of just asking that question, that was deemed so offensive to the history of Russia's heroism, right? The heroic suffering of the people who survived the siege and defended the city, that they actually were banned from the air, right? They lost their access to the airwaves and now exist only as a kind of internet television station. And this was across the board. It's the most dangerous thing to write about in an unconventional way because the official memory of it is so dominant. By contrast, this memory of Stalinist political repressions is really marginal to the official narrative. Putin does not deny Stalin's crimes, and his speech on Monday was quite anti-Soviet. Really, it was all about how what's wrong with Ukraine is that Lenin created it. And he even tries to rename it Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's Ukraine. and sort of blame its existence on Lenin's terrible errors. So Putin does not deny Stalin's crimes, and even there are official efforts to recognize them officially and create new monuments. But what has been unpopular is their commemoration outside of state kind of guidelines and civil society groups. So independent commemoration of those crimes is increasingly marginalized and undermined. So the key example, of course, is the recent legal case against Memorial, which is Russia's most venerable 20th century historical, commemorative, and human rights organization. So it does multiple things. It maintains archives where people have for decades now. It was founded in the late 80s. Contributed family papers, right? So people's precious diaries and memories of their family and loved ones who were victims of Stalin have contributed to this collective community archive. They sponsor research, they conduct research, they also document human rights violations in the present. So they have been ordered to be liquidated, and the people who work there are working very hard to try to preserve the documents and be able to continue their activities in whatever way is still legally possible. So both of these two kinds of collective memory have generated important kind of popular movements. So much like the groups concerned with the commemoration of the Holocaust, who are worried, rightly so, that as people who've actually survived the Holocaust themselves are dying off, right? It's now been long enough. We're losing the last Holocaust survivors. How do you commemorate something where the real survivors are no longer with us? The same problem affects people concerned about veterans from the Great Patriotic War, or World War II. It's really central to the commemoration. The veterans have, since the war, been coming out to the parade, and they're always shown on TV with rows and rows of medals, and they're kind of really celebrated publicly as part of how World War II is commemorated. Now that they're beginning to die off, a pair of activists in Siberia came up with, from the ground up, these are regular citizens, came up with the idea of the Immortal Regiments. So it's a grassroots movement where people would march, and they started just in their small Siberian city, with portraits of their relatives who are maybe no longer with us, but who had served in World War II, so that they could still be celebrated at this moment on Victory Day and be present there. So they would bring these pictures. It's organized from below in 2012 in Tomsk, in Siberia. And then it gets kind of popular. So people increasingly kind of co-opt it. The state gets very involved. So you can see it gets bigger and bigger. It happens in Moscow. People start participating who are political leaders themselves, right? It really gains a lot of energy and becomes kind of official. Putin himself participated with a picture of his father, who was in the siege of Leningrad. So kind of, politicians jump on board this popular commemoration. Then there's the question, of sort of who can, this also takes place in the United States, I should add. One of my friends' grandfather is a veteran, and they come and pick him up from his retirement home in Baltimore every year on Victory Day and drive him to DC. And he participates in those events, right? So it's a really effortful, authentic kind of thing. So it takes place all over the world. People start to adapt the meaning. So there's the kind of people who are still fans of Stalin have made a Immortal Stalinist regiment, right? And start marching with his portrait, which kind of complicates the message. Then, Natalia Polkonska, who's a kind of controversial Russian politician who had been a Ukrainian official. When they annexed Crimea, she crosses over and becomes the kind of head politician in Crimea after the annexation. She brings not a picture of a relative from World War II, but an icon depicting Nicholas II. So there's some strange choices. People say, who belongs in this? Who are we commemorating? And then, of course, there's, right, in addition to commemorating Stalin in his kind of Soviet-era role as a the leader of the war, post-war movies really argue that Stalin is solely responsible for the victory, which is, of course, the opposite of the meaning of the Immortal Regiment, where the message is that veterans, regular people who served and suffered, are the ones who won the war. Then you've got people like Molotov, who was Stalin's right-hand man, always denied that the terror had been a mistake. Really, maybe there were some excesses, but it was always necessary. Most of those people really were enemies. Molotov is not an appealing person. His grandson shows up with a picture of him, right? So, how do we control the boundaries of this becomes quite controversial. All right. Then, in response to this, Memorial, together with similar activists from its kind of grassroots network, created a corresponding movement called the Immortal Barrack, or basically the kind of gulag being the Soviet prison system. It's an acronym that stands for State Administration of Prison Camps, so it's really just a kind of acronym for their penal system in general, but it in English sounds very special and Soviet and alarming. They created a corresponding thing that is also about memorialization from below. There's some criticism of them for perhaps appropriating this kind of movement, but I would argue Russian society really needs to kind of reckon with both the enormous losses of the war and the smaller but especially bitter losses to Stalin's terror and the Gulag. So this was also quite creative. So both it had an online dimension, collecting archival documents around specific people, again with the goal of commemorating individual lives, right, that had suffered as part of historical experiences. So people were able to kind of collect and access documents from their relatives. And this is an important thing, to have a family connection to victims, because that's the only way that you can access the inheritor of the Soviet KGB, the FSB archives, is if you're a relative. So if your grandfather was arrested and repressed, then you can go and access the documents. So it gives the kind of special status of family members in commemorating this history. I should say there are also a lot of online projects designed to collect this kind of individual and family memory of World War II as well. This one is called I Remember, Я помню. So there's lots of places where you can kind of search by your regiment and find your friends and tell your stories. Social media was used heavily. The hashtag Immortal Barrack was used by people to kind of talk about their relatives, and also kind of the involvement of children and telling your children about your family's history of repression under Stalin was also something that the project encouraged. And then individual picketers would kind of hold up information about the connection between individuals who were arrested and specific places in the city. So this project was called the Topography of Terror. It's quite similar to what they've done in Berlin with the commemoration of Holocaust victims, where there's kind of markers in the city where people lived who were arrested and expropriated and deported. So here, people would simply go and hold up a sign in this kind of individual picket that's been a Russian protest strategy since the Soviet period. A large group protest will draw police to beat you up, but individual protesters will still be arrested, but you might manage to stand there a little bit longer. The whole experience is somewhat less violent. And it's kind of moving and compelling, right? An individual's bravery to stand there and await arrest. And then you can have conversations with people too, right? If you're kind of holding up this information, they would sort of start conversations with people on the street. And I guess I'll stop. I have a few final things to say, I suppose. Just what should we sort of take from all of this? I think having memory wars about the past ultimately makes Russia a normal country, right? Struggling over both controlling the past and the direction of the future. And these fights in Russia, just as they are here in the US or many other countries, are very much about issues that engage the whole population. So if Putin had a heart attack tomorrow, these fundamental questions and conflicts about Russia's relationship with the West and with its former imperial territories, about which heroes from the past, leaders or citizens, we should elevate, and about how to address past crimes committed both by the state and by individual perpetrators will very much remain, right? So Putin will come and go, but these questions will still be there. And finally, despite Putin's desire to convince us otherwise in his speech on Monday night, neither we nor Ukrainians are prisoners of one man's version of the past, right? History will always be an important place for telling stories that can help us understand the present and build a more unified and just future. Others will try to use the past to silence us and justify violence and attacks on democracy. That's never going to stop. And Putin may be outraged that the 20th century brought an end to the Russian Empire, just as it did to the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. But as a dear friend who I've thanked for her help with this lecture, and just talking to me about this speech on Monday for the last 48 hours, has written in her commentary on the last few days' events, history is full of such laments, right? So bad news. Sometimes stuff happens and historical errors just become the truth. All right. Thank you very much.
So, questions? I'll run the microphone around to you for any questions.
Very good talk, thank you.
Thanks.
There's a enclave right above Poland, and it is Russian, but they tend to favor Europe, I think. And they also have nuclear weapons. Would that enclave participate with Russia if there was a war? With Russia?
Kaliningrad is a part of the Russian Federation, absolutely. A friend of mine is writing a book about Kaliningrad because it is a strange and unusual post-war story. But it's still there. And I mean, in the sense that they undoubtedly have people who serve in the army who are from Kaliningrad, yes. I think it depends what we mean by participate. But yeah, it's absolutely a part of the Russian Federation. I don't think that, whether they would base troops there or something, I can't speculate. But there is Kaliningrad. It is a funny place. And yes, it is absolutely part of the Russian Federation. So they will participate in some sense. Oh, there's someone in the back too. Yeah.
It seems pretty clear that part of taking over Crimea had a lot to do with making sure that they had a year-round seaport. That was very significant. The other thing that I haven't heard anything about recently is the significance of the Ukraine as far as a food provider to the greater Russia area. I mean, it's been traditionally the, quote, breadbasket of the area, but haven't heard anything about that. Is that still significant or not?
That's a great question. So yes, I mean, agriculture does remain a kind of ongoing problem in Russia, although it's quite modernized, and their climate difficulties now have led them to do things like be leaders in the creation of artificial meat. So some of the kind of high-tech environmental solutions to feeding us in an era of climate change are actually, Russia has a reason to engage in those because they keep struggling with dairy agriculture and other things like that. However, I mean, I think since the annexation of Crimea and the implementation of kind of more sweeping sanctions, there was a real effort and desire to, stimulate Russian agriculture and food industry to be able to replace what had been imported. And a kind of thrill, actually, that they were going to get the chance to do that now that market conditions would favor it. But I did eat a lot of bad, adulterated dairy products there for a couple years after 2014 when staying in hotels. You're like, this dairy product is not entirely dairy anymore. There's some oil in here. So it is an ongoing problem. I don't think, in the context of like global grain markets, that they're really having trouble feeding people because of low agricultural production. They can also import grain from places that are not sanctioning them, like China and other places. So I think, in a way it's true, but I don't think that that's come up. There's not much public support for this invasion in general. And there's certainly no interest in a large-scale invasion in Ukraine among the Russian population, according to polls. So it's not as though people are like, let's get our breadbasket back, right? This is kind of an unpopular move that Putin has to very carefully justify with history and other things. But that's a great question. It is still an issue.
Yeah, I was noticing the pictures of these brave individual protesters. They know they're going to get arrested. How long? I mean, is it just overnight in jail and they're released, or are they sentenced for longer?
It can be long. I mean, the most shocking case, this guy literally was just arrested like yesterday, so I don't know for him, but he's going to be held in jail. Now it's standard to be held in jail until your trial, so that can be months, right? And the most recent kind of shocking case I saw as a parent of a child who plays Minecraft is these 14-year-olds who were playing Minecraft and built a model of the FSB building in downtown Moscow, the Lubyanka, the kind of famous building that was the site of Stalin's repressions. It's still the headquarters of the Russian kind of secret police. And, all of this took place in the world of Minecraft, to be clear, right? They built a copy of the FSB building And they talked on their chat threads about possibly blowing it up. Like, haha, wouldn't that be funny if we blew up the FSB headquarters in Minecraft? These children are 14 years old, right? And that kid was just sentenced to 4 years in jail. So, I mean, they're really not, it's really been a change in tone. I really have always been a big Russia optimist, and I still feel that way because the Russian people that I know are really smart and sensible, and they're very diverse and have lots of different views. But those kinds of cases are horrifying, right? And there's been a little bit more of that. It's changed the kind of tone of things. But there's still a lot of people who are interested in resisting and are very brave.
Thank you.
It's so nice to see Russian people celebrating the legacy of their veterans. I wonder, are there parallels between their veteran culture and their country compared to ours here, say between Vietnam era and kind of the revival of that since like this storm?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I think, there's a lot to kind of admire and learn from in the way that they treat, especially veterans of World War II. But I think there's a danger that they're experiencing that the US also has of some conflicts being more morally admirable than others. And so for a long time, veterans of Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, right, were not treated with the same public commemoration. They still aren't really. And I once had a conversation where a friend said, well, I don't really think of them as veterans, right? Veterans is the Second World War. And so these more complex conflicts that are less a source of national pride and kind of universal agreement that was a great war to be in, have had to make their own commemorative communities. So there's a wonderful book about Afghan veterans and how they essentially write their own songs. They, meet with one another. They've kind of created their own culture to support one another and feel visible, because what veteran often means in Russia is really quite World War II veterans, and that's very painful, obviously, for people who've suffered a lot in service in other conflicts. I think the wars in Chechnya have a kind of similar effect. There's some very powerful groups of mothers of soldiers who died in Chechnya, but that's a little bit of a different thing than extensive public celebration, right? And so I think they're struggling to recapture that for later conflicts. Though I will say the couple of current Army officers I've met socially, do seem proud of their service, right? And I think they're quite well taken care of now in a way that, there's been a substantial investment in salary and benefits so that serving in the military is more prestigious and more kind of comfortable than it was before, which is good too.
My question is it mandatory to serve in the military, and do you have a choice of Army, Navy, whatever, or is it a voluntary system?
So it is technically mandatory, but if you're a university student, then you're exempted. So there's a moment where you have to decide whether you're going to do your 2-year service. Exactly how you do or don't get out of it is a question. Theoretically, it's universal for men. But I do, certainly in the Soviet period, it was also universal, and yet people did all kinds of things, right? There were doctors you could pay off to describe you as mentally ill in a way that would get you off of military service. Because it is quite, they've had a lot of problems with hazing. There's a lot of violence within the kind of ranks of the military for people who are not, say, commissioned officers, but serving their 2-year mandatory time in the Army. Conditions can be quite rough. So it's not a volunteer service, and yet some privileged people are quite able to avoid it through study and choosing the right fields of study and that kind of thing.
Well, I have a question, and that is, you talked about how in those parades there were people talking about Stalin and saying how big he was. What is the official history about communism? Do they use the word communism in a pejorative or a good sense?
It's complicated because I think they would like to keep the good parts of what happened during the Soviet Union, including World War II, and the development of the country, right? All kinds of economic modernization that took place, particularly under Stalin, and some of the aspects of the welfare state that were well developed, right? The healthcare system was pretty good. They had free universal healthcare and education, right? Which may have been not quite as what they wanted in all cases, but was probably better than not having that. So the decline of some of those things has created nostalgia for some of those systems that they still have essentially free-ish education, particularly if you're a good student, and mostly free, certainly a public medical system. So it kind of depends which communism we're talking about. I would say, Stalin's memory is hyper-controversial. So on the one hand, he is the leader during World War II. So there are those who want to commemorate him really explicitly, and there are people still trying to build new Stalin monuments in different cities. However, I actually didn't include a couple of slides of, there's a lot of protests. People sign, tens of thousands of people will sign petitions opposing new Stalin memorials. People very much do remember. School textbooks, I think the line on Stalin's crimes has softened. It's still there. It's kind of errors and excesses, and this happened, but it's brief, as opposed to a kind of full deep dive into all the bad things that happened. This is very similar to, again, like US high school textbooks. How much do we talk about aspects of US history that do not evoke patriotism? Do we talk about them a lot to really get into it, right? Or is that bad and we should raise the youth to be patriotic and we should not talk about those things that much? So people have different views on this, right? And the same is happening there. But they do have a national school system that's much more centralized than ours instead of a state-based kind of textbook. Of course, in the end, Texas ends up dominating because it's a big state. But nonetheless, they have really a national school curriculum and a national high school exam that's run by the state. So there is more coordination on the high school curricula. People have very different views. It's been, there are still some Stalinists out there. They're not a large number of people. There's still a Communist Party, although its platform is no longer about kind of Marxism-Leninism, but rather a kind of more sort of welfare state kind of policy. It's like social democracy in Europe with some weirder nostalgia for specific communist figures in Russia. But they're around. People I saw walked past a communist scouts meeting and procession one time when I was walking through a park. I mean, people are doing their thing. Some of them like to get involved in that kind of nostalgia. Others are full-time committed to fighting against that and to teaching young people about Stalin's crimes in a way that, in the 80s and 90s was really, really the topic of public conversation and now has died down. So I saw there's a great Russian YouTuber who, he started out just interviewing like rappers, but he was kind of smart and interesting. He'd like throw a politician in every once in a while or an activist. And then he started doing documentaries about like the Gulag or the problem of HIV in Russia, right? Really controversial topics, and it would be like a 2-hour documentary. This is all in like the last 5 years. So people are, there's a real market of ideas in a lot of ways, right? Whatever's wrong with that metaphor. But there are a wide range of views on all these questions, all of which are quite lively. Most things don't have to do with whether Putin should leave power. So you can talk about the past in a lot of ways still pretty actively.
Can you speak to the presence of the Orthodox Church in modern-day Russia? Is it only for the babushkas, or is it a general presence?
Oh, it's it's an interesting question. I think, on the one hand, it's, Putin has quite actively tried to, link himself with Orthodoxy at various points. It kind of goes up and down how much he's really leaning into the relationship with the Orthodox Church. But the Orthodox are quite active. They have a number of, they have a chain of some schools. It's not as an American where we have religious schools everywhere, to me it seems kind of weak, right? Like if you really want to be powerful, you need a lot of schools. And the Orthodox Church doesn't have that many schools, not secular schools, like where their schools are not competitors with secular schools in the same way. It's a smaller world. But, it's still very visible. There are still monasteries and monks in public life. The Orthodox Church is very wealthy. It has a number of businesses. They're selling the #1 bottled water in Russia for a long time, Holy Springs, which was called. So, they're very present in public life. But, Putin is very clear that Russia is a multi-confessional, multi-religious place. And so while they're elevated, he's never going to, and the whole state is not interested in very visibly elevating them above Muslim leaders, certain Jewish leaders. They kind of pick and choose their favorites. Among their, the Lubavitch Jewish faith is more in tight with Putin, at least when I last followed this. But nonetheless, they're very clear, and Putin makes a real effort to, this is a great interpretation one scholar had of his habit of trying on costumes that he was doing for a while, kind of in the 2010s when he would dress up as different things, like an archaeologist pulling pottery out of the Black Sea, or he would be like darting the tigers in Siberia. And part of that sort of cosplay thing was, showing different parts of Russian society that he values and respects all of them, right? So, it's also about Russia's great nature and its ancient past, but, he went around and tried on the outfits of a variety of professions. And he's, and the hypermasculinity too, when he was also doing those shirtless photos. Hypermasculinity is available to people of any religion or ethnicity, right? Like anyone can be a manly man, even if you're not Christian or if you're, whatever you are, that's available. So, it's a way of speaking like across religion in a country that's really diverse, and he really wants to preserve that, and he's keeping the aggressive Russian nationalists in a box by kind of really affirming that. So yeah, they're there, but the other religious groups are too, in lots of ways.
Thank you.
Well, I'm just curious, he's not going to live forever, right? So who's his number 1, 2, and 3 man? Are they better or worse?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And this is, something that has been the subject of a lot of different kinds of indirect conversations. Like I've seen historians of Muscovy have made the point that 17th century Russian politics, where everyone declared themselves totally subordinated to the Tsar, like slaves, right? We are submitted to him, really served to conceal a very dynamic political life, where actually there are a lot of factions and a lot of infighting. And a lot of people have explained some of the more dramatic events under Putin, the kind of efforts to interfere in the US election, the murder of Boris Nemtsov, a political opposition leader, in 2015, as actually moments when all those factions, the conflict between them, kind of burst out into public. So those were not necessarily ordered by Putin, but different groups were competing to please him within the state, right? So there's a lot going on under the surface. But Putin has worked very hard so that we don't know what it is, right? It's really hard to know. There are no real press conferences, right? There's not a lot of leaking. It's very difficult to know what's happening in there. And he's made very clear efforts to not designate a clear successor because that would weaken him, right? Especially as he ages and stays in power for a long time. If there was someone who was obviously next, like you would already be a lame duck. And so he doesn't want that. So it's invisible. And I've heard Russian friends who are, not pro-Putin say, let Putin live because whatever's next is going to be worse. He's surrounded himself, at least publicly, with people who seem stupider than him and are more extremist, right? So he doesn't allow anyone really competent. And I think, Alexei Navalny has his pros and cons, but he was a real threat in the sense that he was he's quite popular with at least a substantial part of the Russian population, though far from all. And, you can't have someone like that around if you're trying to conceal any possibilities for succession. So I think that's, yeah. So I don't know what's the answer.
Does the KGB still have influence there? A profound influence, the KGB?
Well, I think there are now several competing elements within the kind of security services. So there's different parts. Some of these questions are great questions for Professor Reuter next week, because he's very much our political science person who is on top of all these things more than I am as a historian. And travels. Professor Reuter can tell you his stories about getting called in to talk to the FSB while doing surveys in provincial Russian cities, like recently. So, yes, but also they're divided internally. There's different agencies. The defense intelligence people, the FSB, there's different constituencies within those intelligence services, and that's where you see them kind of showing off for Putin. So that's one explanation of things like election interference, not just in the US, but in France and other places, is that they're, one-upping each other with their hacking and whatever they're doing. But yes, I think they're influential, but, Putin keeps everyone kind of at a distance so that there's no favorite part, right? The military brass, and, that's an important part of remaining essential also.
All right, I don't see any other questions, but Dr. Evans is giving you a taste of next week.
That's right, it's going to be good.
You should definitely come out for the lecture next week, and then the week after, and the week after. And thank you all for coming, and another round of applause for our speakers.